Accommodating design vehicles is a key part of roundabout design. This module covers an overview of design vehicle considerations. Refer also to part 2 of this module for a hands-on demonstration for how to perform design vehicle swept path checks. The selection of design vehicle is a key consideration at the beginning of a project. Accommodating the design vehicle through the curb lines of a roundabout drives many of the different geometric design elements, such as inscribed circle diameter, lane widths, and entry and exit radii. Ultimately, selection of the design vehicle is going to be based on engineering judgment. It factors in a variety of considerations like field observations, class counts, site contexts and local land use, and roadway functional classification. Table 3-1 of the GDOT Roundabout Design Guide provides a starting point for selection of the design vehicle for your specific project. Check vehicles are larger vehicle combinations that are infrequent at the intersection, but are still expected to potentially need to get through at some point during the design life of the project. This might include oversized, overweight permit loads, or for some non-state route intersections that have smaller design vehicles, a WB67 with a standard 53-foot trailer might also be a check vehicle to make sure that vehicles of that size can still get through the intersection, even though the design may have been set up for a slightly smaller design vehicle. The type of check vehicles that are going to be used are going to vary depending upon the specific site context. And a good place to start is to look at historical OSOW records for that facility. Those records can be requested from the web address on the slide. That's going to give you a better understanding over the last couple of years of the frequency of permit loads, as well as the different types of permit loads that might have gone through there and the range in size and length of those loads. The GDOT Roundabout Design Guide in section 3.6 and Appendix B provides additional information related to OSOW and check vehicles, including a template library to use in AutoTurn or other similar software, as well as additional directions on how to analyze some of the historical permit data and considerations related to single vehicle and multi-vehicle trip permits. When evaluating the swept paths of check vehicles, we're going to make some slightly different assumptions than we would for design vehicle. We're primarily interested in, can that larger check vehicle make it through the intersection, not whether they are able to be accommodated within their travel lane throughout the path. As a result, we're going to assume that those larger OSOW type check vehicles are going to use both lanes, use the full width of the roadway if there's more than one lane through the roundabout. We're going to assume that the cab of the vehicle may need to drive over a truck apron or mountable island to go through the intersection. But really, it's trying to find that path just to be able to make sure that it's being accommodated, that it can get through if one needs to go down that route that takes it through the intersection. As we look at the path that that vehicle takes, there may be areas where additional accommodations are necessary in order to avoid those check vehicles from tearing up landscaping or curb lines or other elements of the roundabout. And so those additional accommodations may include some wider spots along the central island truck apron. It could include a flatter truck apron profile for longer lowboys to get through from a vertical design perspective. It could be outside aprons along the entries, relocating or using sleeves to make signs removable. There's even features like providing a separate bypass lane through the central island that's gated that would specifically allow certain combinations of very large OSOW vehicles. So a variety of strategies may be available. Ultimately, as we're evaluating those paths through, we want to be thinking about things like sign placement and fixed objects to make sure that those aren't going to be impacting the accommodation of these check vehicles through the intersection. We also want to keep in mind to avoid having the check vehicles driving up onto the sidewalk or interfering with some of the other pedestrian features to avoid those types of conflicts. Design vehicle swept path checks are part of an iterative roundabout design process where an initial layout is developed and then checked using AutoTurn or a similar software to verify that the vehicle is accommodated within the travel lane for all left, through, and right turn movements without bumping up over any curb lines or onto sidewalks. The trailer of the vehicle may need to track up onto a truck apron around the central island, which is intended for its use, particularly for the through or left turn movements. However, the starting point, we would typically assume that the cab of the vehicle would not drive up over the truck aprons. The cab of the vehicle would be assumed to stay within the travel lane as it navigates through, and just the trailer off tracking would utilize those apron areas. We want to make sure that we're providing a 1 to 2 foot clearance from any curb faces to the wheels of the design vehicle to account for some of that variability in the specific path that a driver may take as it navigates through the intersection. A 2 foot clearance would reflect the typical width of your gutter pan along the outside curb line. In some cases, we're not able to provide that level of clearance, though, especially with some tight site constraints. So at a bare minimum, we want to make sure that we're providing at least 1 foot of clearance to any curb faces to the vehicle tires. The illustration on the right shows a vehicle swept path as it makes a right turn through the intersection. Along the outside curb line, we're maintaining 2 feet of clearance at all points to all curb faces. You can see we're actually outside of the 2 foot gutter pan all the way around that turn. However, on the inside edge, this figure appears to get closer to some of the curb lines along the splitter islands as well as to the central island. The one thing that's not clear from this illustration, however, is that this swept path is reflecting the overall envelope of the vehicle and not just the envelope of the tires. So it's accounting for the extra overhang on the front of the vehicle and the bumper of the vehicle. And so that's actually pushing the path out a little bit wider. In reality, the tires of the vehicle are staying at least a foot away from all curb faces as it navigates through the intersection. So that's one thing to keep an eye on as a designer or a reviewer. Make sure it's clear what envelope is being illustrated in the figure as you're doing your design checks. There's options to review different envelopes for overhangs or not. There's also options to be able to also turn on the specific path of both the front axles as well as the rear axles of the vehicle. So you're able to see exactly where the wheels of the vehicle are going relative to the curb faces and not just the overhangs of the vehicle. So something to keep an eye out for. In addition to checking larger tractor trailer type combinations, we also want to consider buses and emergency vehicles and these type of smaller vehicles to make sure that they're able to be accommodated within the travel lane without needing to use the aprons. It's undesirable to have a school bus full of kids that are not wearing seatbelts getting jostled around if a bus needs to bump up onto a truck apron in order to get through the intersection. So we'll do a quick check for those types of vehicles as well and just make sure that they can be accommodated within the travel lane. Some elements of a roundabout design end up becoming outcomes of roundabout design checks rather than inputs. One example of this is the width of the truck apron around the central island. Consistent with the guidance in the GDOT Roundabout Design Guide, the figure on the right-hand side shows the sizing of the truck apron width based upon the composite of all of the left turn swept paths around the roundabout, plus adding another 2 foot of width to account for variability in individual drivers as they're navigating through the intersection. So the width of this truck apron around the central island ended up being a direct outcome of the design vehicle checks rather than being a standard dimension. Another area where the design vehicle paths may dictate a design detail is for the right turns, where you may need to have an outside truck apron in some situations. We typically don't go into a design predisposed to providing a truck apron. It's usually only provided where needed. And one of the reasons is it does create some additional conflicts with pedestrians, particularly at the crosswalks. And so, where possible, we try to avoid the use of the aprons as a starter, but where they are needed, trying to avoid having the apron cut through the crosswalk location if possible. Sometimes that's not possible, and there's some additional guidance in section 3.18 of the GDOT Roundabout Design Guide that talks about some of those considerations. But there are situations where, in order to Fit a roundabout either due to site constraints or skew, it becomes necessary to provide those outside aprons to facilitate a cost-effective design. And so for those situations, you would set up the design, run the right turns through, and then size the apron based on what's needed to be able to accommodate those design vehicles around those turns. Multi-lane roundabouts require a designer to define how the design vehicle is going to be accommodated within the roundabout. The GDOT roundabout design guide presents three options: case one, case two, and case three, each with their own assumptions for how the vehicle is going to navigate the intersection and whether or not it stays within its own lane as it travels through. The selection of a particular case is going to be dependent upon factors like the context of the site, the level of constraints of the site, as well as the volume of trucks expected at the intersection. Case one truck accommodation is focused on sites that have lower truck volumes. So the GDOT Roundabout Design Guide defines that as less than approximately 120 trucks per hour. Uh, Urban context with heavy site constraints where a smaller diameter may be needed. These are all examples of possible applications for case one truck accommodation. For case one, we assume that the truck will utilize both lanes as it enters, circulates, and exits the roundabout. So a truck would typically straddle the lane line on the approach to prevent a vehicle from pulling up next to it, and then it would utilize the full width of the roadway as it navigates through the intersection. The width of the truck apron around the central island would be dictated based upon this assumption that the truck is going to use the full two lanes, which usually results in a narrower truck apron for case one type designs. For case two designs, the GDOT Roundabout Design Guide specifies that raised lane dividers should be used between the lanes through the entries and through the exits. This helps to support vehicle channelization and speed control objectives. But for design vehicle check purposes, it means that we need to be keeping the design vehicle in its own individual lane through the entry and exit. So unlike case one designs, we are not utilizing both lanes through the entry and exit. We need to make sure that we're applying appropriate clearances between the truck tires and the curb lines on both sides. And we'll need to check the paths for the through vehicles in each lane individually so that we're making sure that we're providing those clearances from each lane. Within the circulatory roadway, the lane line is striped with rumble strips typically applied. That is intended to prevent passenger cars from crossing the lane line, but it doesn't preclude a truck from doing so. So as we're having the design vehicle navigating through the intersection, if it's necessary for the design vehicle accommodation, we can assume that it may use both lanes as it goes through the intersection. At the very least, you may see a design vehicle on the outside lane where the trailer of that vehicle may encroach some into the adjacent lane, tracking over those striped out lane markings. When checking a left turn vehicle, we would typically assume that vehicle will use the inside entering and circulating lane, and that is going to be used to size our truck apron. Case two designs are typically applied where you have slightly higher truck frequency. JET defines that as greater than 120 trucks per hour, as well as situations where you're not able to accommodate a full case three design, where site constraints may make going to a full case three design not practical. And we'll describe some of those characteristics of a case three design next. Case three truck accommodations allow a design vehicle to navigate through the intersection in its own lane. It also allows for side-by-side design vehicle accommodations. The GDOT Roundabout Design Guide specifies the use of mountable raised lane dividers between lanes through the entry, circulatory roadway, and exit to provide channelization and minimize the potential for vehicle encroachment into the adjacent lane. When checking for design vehicle accommodation, we need to verify that the vehicles are accommodated in each of the individual through lanes, making sure that we're providing appropriate offsets between the truck tires and the raised curb elements. We also need to consider the lane configurations. In this case, we have a left through and through right configuration. and we would need to check to make sure that the right turning vehicles are accommodated from the outside lane and that left turning vehicles are accommodated from the inside lane. So starting in the inside entering lane and staying in the inside lane around the circulatory roadway. This left turn path is also going to dictate the width of our truck apron around the central island. Where feasible, GDOT prefers application of Case 3 truck accommodation strategies. Generally, Case 3 designs have a slightly larger inscribed circle diameter and larger footprint. So for constrained sites where these larger dimensions cannot be accommodated, Case 1 or Case 2 design strategies could be considered instead. I encourage you to refer back to the GDOT Roundabout Design Guide section 3.15, which provides additional information on each of the case strategies.